What are the changes on board we're all going to have to get used to when we start cruising again? I'm Gary Bembridge and I want to talk about some really big changes that are coming to the whole cruising onboard experience that we're all going to have to get used to if we want to go cruising again. I'm going to talk about everything from what venues you can accept, whether you have to do testing, whether you have to wear masks, changes to dining, excursions, the whole gamut of stuff that has been announced and put in place. I've taken a look at cruise lines that are already up and sailing, which includes lines like Ponant, Hurtigruten, Sea Dream, the Royal Caribbean-owned Mein Schiff, which is now sailing in Germany, Carnival Corporation owned AIDA, which is sailing out of Germany as well, and also the Royal Caribbean Hapag-Lloyd brand. But I've also taken a look at the changes that have been put in place and announced by other big cruise lines, including things like Crystal Cruises, Norwegian Cruise Line, Virgin Voyages, and even some of the Asian cruise lines that are now sailing, like Dream, for example, out of Taiwan. So what are these changes that you're going to have to get used to when you go cruising again? And of course, I'd love to hear as we go through this what you think about the changes and if they are likely to put you off cruising when you are able to go cruising next. You're going to have to get used to significant changes in the whole health screening process, not only before you get on the ship, but ongoing throughout your voyage. There's a couple of key things to think about here. First of all, before you board your ship, you're going to have to do an online health questionnaire even before you head off on your cruise. Once you get to the port, you'll then go through a much more detailed health screening. You're going to have a timed arrival, so you're going to have to arrive at a very certain and set time. And that's because the cruise lines are going to be doing a much deeper medically supervised check-in. They're going to look at your questionnaire, they're going to take your temperature and really delve in and approve your health status before they let you board. The second thing that you can expect is temperature checks and more temperature checks. You'll find your temperatures being checked before you enter the terminal, before you board the ship. Once you're on the ship, what we're seeing happening is multiple temperature checks taking place throughout the cruise. You'll normally have your temperature taken before you head into a dining venue, for example, some of the major events, when you get off the ship to head out on an excursion, when you return from an excursion. So constant temperature checking right throughout your cruise experience. This is of course designed to make sure they capture and identify infected passengers as quickly as they possibly can. When it comes to asymptomatic passengers, there is an increasing chance that you are going to have some kind of COVID-19 test. Let's take a look at where that's already happening. First of all crew are going to be COVID-19 tested before they get on a ship to stop asymptomatic crew coming on board. The importance of this is shown just in the last couple of weeks, where crew heading back to board Carnival's AIDA out of Germany were tested, and 10 of them were found to be asymptomatic, having the virus but not knowing. So they were able to identify that crew before they boarded the ship and isolate them. I think we're going to see that increasingly happening with passengers. So let me talk through what I'm seeing and when I think you're going to find that's going to affect you. First of all, it's important to bear in mind that both the EU guidelines to resume cruising in Europe recommended that cruise lines look at testing passengers and crew. The CDC, the US authorities, they are doing a consultation which has just been issued, where testing of passengers and crew before they board is one of the things they're consulting on. So that's definitely on their agenda. Thirdly, we're seeing on cruises which involve international guests joining a cruise, visiting multiple countries, COVID-19 tests are already part of that. So for example, if you want to go and join a cruise in French Polynesia, Iceland, or even if you want to head into Alaska, for example, you have to have a COVID-19 test before you can actually enter those territories, and it's a requirement of boarding a ship. What's also very important is we're also seeing a whole raft of countries requiring COVID-19 tests for land-based visitors. So even those islands in the Caribbean that aren't open to cruise ships yet, many of those are requiring a COVID-19 test before they'll let people enter the country. So a logical extension of that is that probably will extend that to cruising, one would think. But certainly we're seeing, if a cruise is touring around multiple countries, some sort of COVID-19 test seems to be part of what's already in place and could come. Virgin Voyages, for example, have said they plan to have a fast COVID-19 test in place so they can test all passengers before they board their ships when they eventually start sailing. We're seeing for exotic and expedition cruises, COVID-19 tests are part of that. whole process. So for example, as we head into the Antarctic season, Ponant and other major expedition cruise lines are requiring COVID-19 tests from passengers before they head off to board the cruise. In those European cruises that are already up and running, as part of the terms of service, what they say is, although they're not currently requiring general COVID-19 tests, if the R rate, the rate of infection in a particular country or subsection of a country increases, they will introduce COVID-19 tests. So for example, in Germany, although the rate is relatively low, what they're saying is if there is an outbreak or a flare-up in a particular region, you'd need a COVID-19 test if you're coming from that region. So testing and temperature screening is going to be a fundamental part, it seems, at varying levels as we move forward with cruising, something we need to get used to. We're also going to have to get used to social distancing on board cruise ships, pretty much as we're having to get used to that on land. So it's going to reflect very much what's happening on land. There's a couple of ways that we're seeing that changing on cruising. First of all cruise lines have announced or put into place that they are going to sail with lower capacity, so fewer passengers on board. All the cruises that have sailed so far have between 50 and 60% the number of passengers they normally used to carry. And all cruise lines have said, certainly when they start sailing, they will carry fewer passengers. So that enables social distancing. Secondly, they're all putting in place a requirement for passengers to keep 6 feet apart at all times. And what they're doing to enable that to happen is they're putting capacity constraints on a number of venues. So you'll find the theatre, the dining rooms, the pool, elevators, gyms, shops, they all are going to be capacity controlled. Different cruise lines are putting different procedures in place. So some, for example, you're having to book to go to dining in advance, or you're having to book to go to the theatre in advance. But you're going to find there are capacity controls on everything, even including bars. So they're going to limit the numbers of people at any one time in a venue. We've seen, for example, one of the areas that's caused a lot of discussion is around the swimming pools and hot tubs, where both the EU guidelines were pretty strict on those, but cruise lines are limiting the number of people around and spreading out the lounges so that they're 1.5 meters, i.e. 6 feet apart. So expect to have more limited access, or certainly timed access and restricted access to the venues around the ship. One of the other big changes is reinventing the whole muster drill. So Royal Caribbean have launched a new process called Muster 2.0, which is a technology they're rolling across their cruise lines. So that includes, of course, Celebrity and Azamara, but they've also offered the technology to all other cruise lines. The idea with Muster 2.0 is on your interactive television or on your smartphone through the app, you do the whole muster drill process yourself on the app. You then have to go and scan it in and check that you've done the whole process in your actual muster station. So removing the need to bring big groups of people together. Another thing that you're probably going to need to get used to on board is much more activities outdoors. As we all know, outdoors has proven to be a much safer environment to operate in. So, for example, in the EU guidelines, they're encouraging to do more and more activities outdoors, and actually recommending that all indoor pools are closed completely in order to enable social distancing and safer environments. As on land, one of the most hotly debated and discussed topics is around the use of masks. Masks could well play a part on the whole cruising experience that you need to get used to. And certainly those cruise lines that have started sailing, there is varying degrees of the role of masks. What the cruise lines are saying is that they will reflect the mask rules on land in their home port. So if you're sailing out a particular port or particular country that has a set of rules around masks, that will apply once you get on board. The broad brush rule, however, is that masks need to be used in the whole cruising experience when you can't maintain social distancing, which is true, of course, on land. Some of the cruise lines only require, for example, when you're in corridors where you're going to be in close proximity to people, or in large gatherings of people, sometimes on an embarkation or disembarkation where it's harder to do social distancing. Crystal has taken probably one of the stronger views on masks. They're talking about it being required in situations which include before you're seated in a restaurant, in all the show lounges, in the casino, in the elevators, on the tenders, in the terminals, in the tour dispatch areas, and possibly also on excursions if they are required in those local countries. So it is likely that a mask is likely to play some sort of role. And what we've seen of all the cruise lines who've launched is they are providing little packs with things like masks and sanitizing wipes. So you can expect that whatever's happening on land will happen on your cruise ship, and that's something you're going to have to get used to. One of the things you will absolutely have to get used to when it comes to masks is crew will be wearing PPE, personal protective equipment, at all times. So any crew that are passenger facing, they will be wearing either visors or masks or be behind those perspex screens. So crew will have very clear PPE requirements, and you have to get used to crew around you wearing PPE. The next big change that we're going to have to get used to is around the area of dining. The most obvious change of all is that dining times are going to be extended. This is so that they can seat fewer people at any point in time. So you'll find dining is really extended and the tables in the restaurants are spread out much more. Many of the cruise lines are limiting the amount of people at a table to only those people in your cabin or the household that you're traveling with or party that you're traveling with. There's going to be increasing encouraging of passengers to do in-room dining, so that it also reduces the pressure on the number of people in the dining room. There's going to be no self-service at all. And increasingly what we're seeing on those cruise ships that have launched is contactless ordering. So a lot of them are using things like QR codes or paperless menus on the app, so there is a chance to reduce the amount of contact that people have and touching things. A lot of the cruise lines have also instituted something where you have to pre-book all of your dining. Some of the cruise lines, for example with Royal Caribbean's Mein Schiff, you have to have actually booked all of your dining up to 3 days before the cruise. Others basically once you're on the cruise. So you're going to have to find that you're going to have to be much more rigorous about the time you dine, when you dine, and you probably have to book it. And sharing tables is not likely to be something that, if you were used to, you have to get used to not sharing with strangers. Another thing that you may have to get used to is a sudden change in ports and itineraries, not only before you sail, but also once you're sailing. With the virus still out there, there's always a chance of flare-up. So you might find a particular port you were due to go into has a flare-up or has closed down some of their facilities at short notice, and therefore the cruise line will not call on those ports. So you need to expect, as you start traveling and heading out on cruises, pretty much as you do also on land-based, is you might find that suddenly things close. And so you need to expect, almost as a new norm, that the itinerary you head out to do may chop and change. For example, this can happen also with land-based holidays. At the time of recording this, for example, there had been some flare-ups in Spain and governments had started to restrict the amount of people moving in and out of Spain, putting a lot of travel restrictions. That kind of thing could also happen once you're on a cruise. So you need to expect that the itinerary you set off to do may change because of flare-ups. One other thing we're going to have to get used to is around the area of excursions, which could see some pretty big changes. This is separate to the fact that we're seeing a lot of the cruises as they start up, they tend to be a little bit shorter. They're having much fewer ports of call, or some of them even really focusing on much more scenic cruising. When it comes to excursions, we're going to see a real change, and this is in a number of areas that have already started to happen. The concern of ports, of course, is lots of people coming off the cruise ship who may or may not, infect or bring something on to land. And of course there's a concern from the cruise ships and the ports that perhaps people don't pick up something on land and bring it back onto the ship. So what we're seeing is the cruise lines increasingly will be encouraging or even requiring passengers to do cruise line excursions, because these are ones that they can control. They're building alliances with the port authorities and all the providers where they can make sure that the protocols required are enforced. So things like fewer passengers on board the buses being disinfected. They can make sure that the places they visit, they have opportunities for hand sanitizer, hand washing. So all the kind of controls that they're putting in place on board. So you're going to see a lot of pressure or encouragement to do cruise line only excursions. We've already seen some of the ports talking about how they don't believe that there will be independent excursions. They'll all be very much controlled by the cruise lines and signed off by the port authorities to keep people effectively in little bubbles. I think you'll also probably see more and more outdoor type excursions taking place. So expect to see a big pressure and lots of emphasis on doing cruise line excursions rather than independent touring and with independent tour operators. Some of the cruise lines, for example, with their crew have put into the contracts, the crew contracts, that they're not allowed to head off into port when ships are in port. So it's pretty strong and difficult time for the crew. They can't even head off for a couple of hours in port. So that's not true across all cruise lines, but certainly controlling what people do on land is something we're going to have to get very much more used to, certainly in the early stages of cruising. On the plus side, of course, it does mean that excursions are going to have fewer people on. You're going to have more room on the bus. You're going to have much more attention of the tour guide. So that's the plus side, of course, of some of these changes that we could, of course, get really used to, and is actually going to be a plus. There's a whole bunch of changes coming to the cruise experience that we are going to have to adapt to and get used to. Many of these, of course, reflect what we're getting used to on land. So, of course, these will evolve and change as the learning with the virus changes, as more cruise lines come on board. But certainly, I think we're going to see a lot of challenges, particularly with changes for cruise ships that are sailing between multiple countries with international passengers, which is why we've seen a lot of cruise lines start up by sailing in local areas with local passengers only, because this is much easier to control and they have to have much less draconian kind of rules and regulations on board. That's why we're seeing out of Norway, Hurtigruten and Sea Dream sailing, Ponant out of France for French passengers. We're seeing a whole raft of cruise lines, Hapag-Lloyd, Mein Schiff, AIDA out of Germany, and many more regional cruises to come. I'd love to know what you think about these changes and if they are likely to put you off going cruising anytime soon, and certainly when it starts up. I have loads more of videos, of course, to watch of cruising tips, so why don't you watch another one of those right now.